This is Jeff Spittler, May 7th, 2000, A Tale of Two Kingdoms, Part 23. Okay, last week we covered some of the events of James's reign between 1592 and 1596, and today I hope to extend the scope of our knowledge by 4 more years. Last week we covered this threatened return of these treasonous earls, the Melville's Two Kingdoms speech, and we saw this battle for prerogative over the church start to heat up, and it culminated in sort of a funny way last week with this so-called uprising. It turned out to be nothing more than some people running around for a little while. And no blood was shed, and the whole thing was over in less than an hour. Okay, but James, being the politician that he was, you might think of some of our current politicians, immediately grasped the possibilities with respect to this so-called uprising. It could be, and it was, magnified into a treasonable or a treasonous uprising, and for which the ministers were culpable. And the exact words that he used were a cruel and barbarous attempt against His Majesty's royal person, his nobility and council, at the instigation of certain seditious ministers and barons. Okay, so he left the next day in a rush for Linlithgow, which is a town, I don't know, maybe 20 miles west of Edinburgh. And there he issued a series of proclamations, all judges and officers. Yeah, how do you say it, Simon? Linlithgow, yeah. I'll try to, thank you. Very handy to have a resident Englishman here to correct my Scots pronunciation. So, yeah, I get the accent's on the second syllable. Linlithgow, okay. Yeah. Okay, so he left the next day, and he issued these series of proclamations. First of all the judges and officers were to meet him in Linlithgow, and all non-residents of Edinburgh were to leave Edinburgh immediately. The ministers of Edinburgh were ordered to turn themselves in at the castle, and the magistrates were ordered to arrest the ministers. Okay, now, as it turns out, most of the ministers fled, but we'll get to that, I guess, in a minute. The representatives of the town council of Edinburgh went to Linlithgow to meet with the king, and when they were there, they read the Riot Act. In this one book I have, it says that he threatened to take away the capital, or he made the capital someplace else. But what they were actually told was that the city would be razed to the ground and sowed with salt, that they would be overrun by borderers. Right, the people who lived along the Scottish borders had a reputation for outlawry, so being completely overawed, they agreed to sign a bond representing the community, to which they would not receive their ministers back unless the king approved. And in the future, the king would always have veto power over all future choices of ministers and magistrates. So, let's see. I think he also moved the judiciary to Perth. And apparently they felt there's a real threat that he was going to move the capital away. Okay, a few weeks later he returned sort of at the head of a military procession, and he made some more proclamations, one of which was that no meeting of the General Assembly, Provincial Assembly, or Presbytery should ever be held in Edinburgh again. So, okay, the ministers themselves had fled either to England, or 2 of them fled to Fife, which is north of Edinburgh, and hid themselves. He's going to use this as an excuse now to proceed on his grand plan. But before we get to his grand plan, I wanted to look briefly at 2 works that he was writing. They were published in 1598 and 1599. But James, being so bright, of course, also had to be an author. So these were literary works. One was called The True Law of Free Monarchies, and the other one was called the Basilican Doron, which would be instructions from the king to his son. Okay, so this true law of free monarchies had as its theme that the The king's power was complete and arbitrary. He could do anything that he wanted. It was free. He called himself an absolute and free monarch. Free meaning he was free from all other laws. And he answered only to God, is what he would say. And if he answered to God in a way that we didn't think, that was sinful, well, that was part of God's judgment on the people. Let's see. This is quoted by Macri in his Life of Melville, but he says this is actually a quote from the book, that a good king will frame all his actions according to the law, yet is he not bound thereto, but of his good will. Although he be above the law, he will subject and frame his actions thereto for example's sake to his subjects, and of his own free will, but not as subject or bound thereto. So in other words, it was a good idea for a king to sort of follow the law, but if he didn't, well, it's life. Interestingly enough, in scriptural proof of this doctrine, he offers the passage from 1 Samuel 8 where Samuel warns the Israelites of all the tyranny they'll suffer under when they get a king. But he reads this and thinks, well, this is pretty good. See, a king can do this, a king can do that, etc., etc. So, interestingly enough, this was partly addressed to the people of England who were sort of looking forward to him as their king. Elizabeth dies in 1603, so she's actually fairly elderly at this point, and obviously there's no heirs in sight. So he told them, he plainly told them that they were to be governed as a conquered kingdom, and if they were disappointed of the benefit which they expected to, quote, get of him in fighting their battles, they had themselves to blame, as he never gave any large promises on that head. But he performed for them services of more valuable kind as the great schoolmaster of the whole land. That's his own description. And he taught them a style utterly unknown to the ancients, banished the writings of Calvin, Buchanan, Ponet, and such like, quote, apologies for rebellions and treasons, which had obtained too great authority among them. And he furnished orthodox textbooks from which the orators of Cam and Isis might preach the right divine of kings to govern wrong. That's a quote. From James, from the book. So, the other book, and that book was free. It was widely published. It was sold widely in England. The other book wasn't so widely published. In fact, the first printing, there were only 7 copies made because he didn't want it really to get out. And then when it finally was published, he wrote this kind of funny apology at the beginning, which made a lot of said he didn't, when he used the word Puritan, he only meant this one obscure sect, and he sort of waffled on everything. But interestingly enough, he gave out 7 copies to members of his court. One was on pretty good relations with Andrew Melville. He showed him a copy, and Andrew Melville, took notes and presented them at the next Presbytery meeting. And they debated them. So. This is about sort of a page-and-a-half quote, but I think it's worthwhile reading just to give an insight into just sort of James's mind. He's writing to his son, who's I don't know, 5, 6 years old at this point. He was born in the last class or during the period of the last class, so something like that. So he's writing for his future, and this is an excerpt. This comes from a source book of Scottish history, which has quite a few of the original documents, although, as in this case, it's not the whole thing. It's just sort of chief excerpts. So he says, the reformation of religion in Scotland being made by a popular tumult and rebellion, and not proceeding from the prince's order, as it did in England, some of our fiery ministers got such a guiding of the people at that time of confusion, as finding the taste of government sweet, they began to fantasy to themselves a democratic form of government. And after usurping the liberty of the time in my long minority, settled themselves so fast upon that imagined democracy as they felt themselves with that hope to become tribuni plebis. And because there was ever some learned and honest men of the ministry that were ashamed of the presumption of these seditious people, there could no way be found out so meet for maintaining their plots as parity in the church, whereby the ignorance were emboldened, to cry the learned, godly, and modest out of it, parity, the mother of confusion and enemy to unity, which is the mother of order. by the example whereof in the ecclesiastical government they think, with time, to draw the politic and civil government to the like. Okay, so he says this parity among ministers will eventually result in drawing the civil government to some level of parity. In fact, it eventually does, but it draws it away from this absolute free monarchy that he's so fond of. For preservative against their poison, entertain and advance the godly, learned, and modest men of the ministry, whom of God be praised, there lacketh not a reasonable number. And by their preferment to bishoprics and benefices, annulling that vile act of annexation, if you find it not done to your hand, ye shall not only banish their parity, which I cannot agree with a monarchy, but ye shall also reestablish the old institution of 3 estates in Parliament, which can no otherwise be done. Cherish no man more than a good pastor, hate no man more than a proud Puritan, thinking it one of your fairest styles to be called a loving nurse father to the church, seeing all the churches within your dominions planted with good pastors, the doctrine and discipline maintained in purity according to God's word, a sufficient provision for their sustentation, a comely order in their policy, pride punished, humility advanced, and they so to reverence their superiors and their flocks them, as the flourishing of your church in piety, peace, and learning may be one of the chief points of your earthly glory, being ever alike at war with both the extremities, as well as you repress the vain Puritans, so not to suffer proud papal bishops. What is betwixt the pride of a glorious Nebuchadnezzar and the preposterous humility of our Puritan ministers, claiming to their parity and crying, we are all but vile worms, and yet will judge and give law to their king, but will be judged and controlled by none? Surely there is more pride under such a one's black bonnet, nor under great Alexander's diadem. Okay, so we don't know how long this has been in press for, but it came out in 1599, and what you're going to see is that, let's see, this sort of second paragraph here about appointing godly, learned, and modest men of the ministry to bishoprics and benefices, and reestablishing the old institution of 3 estates. Well, he accomplishes that very shortly. So it's obvious. It's certainly part of his plan. Yes, Dan.
When did the Puritans come into their own, sort of as a recognizable sect? And were they just in England, or were they in Scotland as well?
Well, the term, right, was a derogatory one, referred to those who wanted to reform every part of the church or purify every part of the church.
Okay.
So, I mean, they've been around since the Reformation, basically.
But they were just called that in a derisive.
Yeah, right. And I mean, you could say they really come into their own when they finally cut off Charles I's head, but get Cromwell as their chief. But no, there's the whole sorts of things that we've been looking at in Scotland. There's sort of been similar arguments and so on going on in England. I mean, there's not exactly the same, but there are men who want to separate from the Church of England because of its various practices and so on. And in fact, Elizabeth does quite a bit to suppress them. I mean, even executing these people. So I've kind of skipped over it and tried to stick with Scotland mostly. But he was aware of the sort of Puritans in both countries and didn't like either kind. Mike.
It appears, that he had really well thought out this plan, or had this tormenting in his heart for quite a while, like he was going to put the church underneath his thumb.
Right.
What did the church think? You maybe were going to tell us, but what did the church think when he just told us? They ought to know that, the gig is up.
Yeah, they. Well, I think that's what we're going to see. What their reaction to all this is. He's quite clever, though. You're going to say he. Well, I mean, not to give away the rest of the story, but one of the things he does is he gets all kinds of ministers and elders from the north of Scotland.
Liberals?
Yeah, well, liberal might be the right word, or reactionary, or I'm not sure. This is a little. Ones that would sort of bend to his way of thinking, and he got them in and was able to sort of overrule the rest of the church. So, Anyways, that's what we're going to cover today. How did he accomplish all this? But I thought that the extracts from his book were pretty interesting. Is that my daughter making noise? Shh. Okay, well, with the people now in the right frame of mind, in other words, sort of cowed by the king's actions, he proceeded with his plans. He started by drawing up a list of 55 questions to be debated or discussed at the General Assembly meeting. There was one to be scheduled at Perth at the end of February in 1598. This was a special meeting called by the king. And you recall one of the things that the king basically got over on the church was this ability to control the meeting schedule. And he's going to use this to great effect. Well, since you asked that question, Mike, I had a quote in here. The Synod of Fife met before this meeting of the General Assembly, and they actually gave them they gave sort of a commission instructions. The first instruction was they were supposed to wait to discuss this until the meeting of the General Assembly, and to postpone this extraordinary meeting that he had called. And if he wouldn't comply with that request, then they advised them to participate, but they told them what they should do, and they were instructed to declare that they could not acknowledge that meeting as a lawful General Assembly, nor consent that it should call in question or innovate the established polity of the Church. And if that were decided against them, they were to protest for the liberties of the Church and not to approve any of the subsequent proceedings. And they were instructed to adhere to some general principles, that the external government of the Church is laid down in the Word of God, that it belongs to the pastors and doctors of the Church to declare what the Scriptures teach on this head. And as a scriptural form of government and discipline had after long and grave deliberation been regularly settled in Scotland, as by means of it the Church had for many years been happily ruled and preserved from heresy and schism, and as none of the ecclesiastical office-bearers moved any doubts about it, that His Majesty should be requested not to disturb such a rare, peaceable, and decent constitution by the agitating of fruitless and unnecessary questions. Okay. They were completely unsuccessful. I mean, that's basically he just went past every step that they had instructed their commissioners to adhere to. Okay, so what he did was he resorted to his kingcraft, politicking. The ministers from the North of Scotland previously had not come to most of the General Assembly meetings. They were very poorly paid, and it was not inexpensive to travel from the north of the country to the south. Let's see, to quote McCree again, they were comparatively unacquainted with its modes of procedure and strangers to the designs of the court, not to mention their general inferiority in point of gifts to their brethren of the south. Okay, so what the king did was he sent his emissary, a guy named Sir Patrick Murray. He was one of the gentlemen of the bedchamber, and he to visit the presbyteries in Angus and Aberdeenshire, and he was supposed to tell them about this late dangerous tumult, the undutiful and treasonable conduct of the ministers, and to get them to send some of their members to the General Assembly to resolve His Majesty's questions, which had already received the approval of the discreetest of the southern ministers. So basically, he went up there to persuade them, but interestingly enough, he also paid them. Now, all we know is that he paid them their expenses to come to the meeting. I mean, we don't really know if it went beyond that, but he basically got a lot of extra representatives to come to the meeting, and that made it difficult for the church, if we'll say the conservative church or the biblical church, to withstand the king's logic, as it were. It took 3 days for them to decide that the meeting was lawful, but then they did decide it was lawful if extraordinarily convened. And then they agreed it's lawful to His Majesty's or to the pastors to propone in a general assembly whatsoever point they desire to be resolved or reformed in matters of external government. So actually this first of the 55 questions was related as to whether or not the king or the ministers could bring up something to be discussed, debated, and acted upon in the General Assembly. Right, so this is a new innovation for the king to bring things up to be debated and acted upon into the General Assembly. Okay, they apparently also agreed to some restrictions on the scope of their sermons, so I don't have any more details beyond that. But James Melville, who was Andrew Melville's nephew and worked closely with him, gives an account of the meeting. Coming to Perth, we found the ministers of the North convened in such number as was not wont to be seen at any assemblies, and every one a greater courtier nor another, so that my ears heard new votes, and my eyes saw a new sight, to wit, flocks of ministers going in and out at the king's palace, late at night and betimes in the morning. Sir Patrick Murray, the diligent apostle of the North, this is very sarcastic here, had made all the Northland ministers acquainted with the king. They began then to look big in the matter and find fault with the ministers of the South and the popes of Edinburgh, who had not handled matters well but had almost lost the king. So, in other words, by means of, sending people out to the north, bringing these guys in, apparently whining and dining them, I guess, while they were there, he persuaded enough of them to get a majority vote as to what he wanted. And although, there wasn't very much decided at this General Assembly, this was really sort of a watershed event. At this point, the king's figured out how to get his way. It's, sort of a combination of intimidation on the one hand, and on the other hand, sweet-talking the right people, the ministers that he could persuade. And this actually sort of sets the pattern from here on out. He kind of goes with this combination of intimidation and persuasion that's fairly successful. So they had another meeting in Dundee. He also moved, instead of meeting down in the south, he met up more to the center of the north of the country in Perth and Dundee and even up in Aberdeen. So his at the next meeting, Melville says Macri, to advance his schemes with an assembly so much on its guard, required all the peculiar cunning of the crafty monarch, but craft was his element, and false pretenses were his weapons. And thus he prevailed over men who were too honest themselves thoroughly to understand his guile. So his next step was to request them to appoint a committee or commission to advise him on issues that couldn't be conveniently handled at the General Assembly. Right? In a sense, you could say, well, this sounds innocent enough, and perhaps to the ministers it sounded innocent enough. But what happened was they agreed to appoint a committee of 14, and any 7 of which would form a quorum for purposes of advising the king. And this became the king's ecclesiastical council. And as it turned out, most of the men that were appointed were sort of the king's desired men, as it were. They appointed a few other ones for appearance's sake, but by and large it was mostly the men the king wanted. When he left Dundee, he went to Falkland, and he had in tow his privy council and his ecclesiastical council, or if you will, a privy council with a sort of ecclesiastical component and a lay component. His usual privy council and then these extra ministers. He called there a meeting of the Presbytery of St. Andrews, and he basically overturned one of their decisions where they had deposed the minister. And whether or not there was some kind of ulterior motive, or if he was just trying to show sort of his power over the church and get them used to him, having the final say on everything, I'm not sure. But then went to St. Andrews, and the Privy Council and the Ecclesiastical Council formed a set of a review board for the university called the Royal Visitors. And they actually put out like a notice asking people to provide their griefs and disorders and controversies and abuses that they were aware of. So all the people who wanted to complain came in. And still after all that, they weren't able to find anything that they could indict Andrew Melville with. He was rector of the university. And having not found anything, they decided that they would change the governance of the university. Melville wasn't really in favor of being rector. I'm not clear on the reasons, but for whatever reason, he didn't think it was a good idea. So they just said that it wasn't a good idea, and they appointed a council instead. The council was nominated by the king, and they were to control the university. So that's the way they replaced Andrew Melville. And then, on the pretext of not distracting the professors from their duties, they forbade them from sitting on sessions, presbyteries, synods, and the General Assembly. Okay, so keep in mind now, up until now, Melville was one of the king's chief antagonists. And in fact, at this last meeting, he had actually been absent because he was on some other university business or something. So, but by way of sort of giving a sop to the professors, they allowed them to nominate 3 people from whom the King's Council would choose one person who could represent the university at the General Assembly. Okay, and of that one person, he could serve at most once every 4 years. So this way, he was pretty much assured that he would never have to see Andrew Melville in the General Assembly again. Except for Melville later pointed out that his authority to attend the General Assembly did not come from his position at the university, rather it came from his office in the church. So it got to be a bit of a battle. He came to some of the meetings, and the king kicked him out, and so on. Okay, so let's see. That was in May of 97, right? A few months later, in December, he got his ecclesiastical council to present a petition to Parliament, right? They're supposed to advise them on these things. And the sort of things that he gave examples of were on paying ministers stipends and appointing ministers in Edinburgh and a few other issues that were comparatively minor. But he got the ecclesiastical council to present a petition to Parliament to request that the church might have a vote in Parliament. Okay. And the way this vote would work is that, the king then induced the Parliament to agree that any ministers that James might appoint would have the right to sit and vote in Parliament. So in other words, he, by sort of a 2-step procedure, he got them to agree to the old office of bishops, not necessarily named bishops, but bishops in terms of voting in Parliament. And there weren't the ministers that would be appointed by the church, rather they were ministers that he would appoint. So it shouldn't be missed that not only is this a sort of an assault on the liberties of the church, it's also an assault on the liberties of Parliament. It's, sort of like if our president came in and said, I think we need, another 50 senators, and I'll appoint them, that kind of thing. I guess when FDR came into office, he tried to increase the size of the Supreme Court. It was basically that issue. Okay. So, prior to the next meeting of the General Assembly, there was some additional politicking to smooth the way for the church to approve of this arrangement. And at a meeting of the Synod of Fife, where Andrew and James Melville strongly opposed the measure, Sky John Davidson, who we've discussed before, said, and I quote, busk him as bonnily as you can and fetch him as fairly as you will. We see him well enough. We see the horns of his mitre. So, in other words, he could see that it was a bishop. That's what he was establishing. Okay, so the next meeting, again called by the king of the General Assembly, was in Dundee in March of 1598. And Andrew Melville appeared anyways. He defended his right to be there because his office came from the church, not from the university. But nevertheless, the king banished him from the meeting and from town. Using sort of all his kingcraft and all his northern ministers, James was able to get the General Assembly to agree to approve the appointment of ministers to vote in Parliament. Okay, but when they started to work on the details, the King's party got nervous because it wasn't going quite the way they wanted. So the meeting was adjourned. Okay, so they scheduled another meeting for Aberdeen in July 1599. Okay, but the king, not having gotten all his political ducks in a row, postponed the meeting until March 1600. Okay, in the meantime, he kept working on this. So in November of 1599, he held a conference with ministers from all over the country. Now, this conference had no authority to do anything. It just, I guess several people have speculated they were just trying to find out what the opposition to these measures were going to be so they could figure out how to counter it. They debated 3 questions, which are kind of interesting, or particularly interesting from our viewpoint. The first one was asked whether or not it was consistent with the nature of their office, its duties, and the directions of Scripture about it, for ministers of the gospel to undertake a civil function. In other words, could somebody be a minister and also a member of Parliament? And McCree summarizes the arguments on both sides. It's a bit of a lengthy quote, but as it goes directly to this two kingdoms theme of the class, I thought I might read it. Okay, so those who maintain the affirmative, in other words, those who were in favor of ministers being able to serve in Parliament, argued that as the gospel does not destroy civil policy, so it does not hinder any of those who profess it from discharging political duties. That when ministers are enjoined, quote, not to entangle themselves with the affairs of this life, they are not prohibited from discharging civil offices any more than the duties of natural economy and domestic life. I guess I would try to put the argument on pair, or against the Roman Catholic celibacy of the priesthood. That there are approved examples in Scripture of sacred and civil offices being united in the same person. The ministers were as much distracted from the duties of their office by the visitation of churches and waiting on meetings for fixing stipends as they would be by sitting in parliaments and conventions of estates. That it was allowed by all that ministers might wait on His Majesty and give him their advice in matters of state. That as free men and citizens, ministers were entitled to be represented as well as the other orders in the state. That the General Assembly had often craved a vote in Parliament, and that ecclesiastical persons had sat in that court since the Reformation. Now, those arguments, they're not all bad arguments. One could argue that this isn't really the point, whether or not ministers could serve as members of Parliament, whether or not the king could appoint ministers to serve as members of Parliament. But that wasn't the question that was raised. Okay, in the negative, it was argued that though the gospel by no means destroys civil policy, yet all political laws which are inconsistent with it or which interfere with any of its institutions are unlawful. That the duties of natural and domestic economy are altogether different from those which belong to public offices of society. That when the apostle prohibits ministers from entangling themselves with the affairs of this life, he puts his meaning out of doubt by referring as an illustration to the case of a soldier who must renounce and avoid all worldly occupations that he may devote himself to the military life and entirely please and obey his commander. That the duties of the ministerial office are so great and manifold, and the injunctions to constant and unremitted diligence in discharging them so numerous, so solemn, and so urgent, that no minister who is duly impressed with these will accept of another function which must engross so much of his time and attention. That it is criminal to throw temptations to this in the way. That the union of sacred and civil offices in certain individuals mentioned in Scripture was extraordinary and typical. And when the Jewish polity was established, these offices were separated and could not be lawfully discharged by the same persons. That the occasional visitations of churches is a part of the ministerial function. That if ministers are diverted from their pastoral duty by commissions for fixing stipends, this is owing to a defect in the establishment, which they had long complained of, and for which the magistrates and their flocks must answer. That ministers as such do not form an order in the state, and that as citizens they are represented along with others by the commissioners of shires and burghs. That if the king and estates entrust ministers with the care of their souls, the latter may surely give credit to the former in what relates to their bodies. That no General Assembly before the last one had ever craved a vote for ministers in Parliament, and that ever since the Church had condemned episcopacy, she had objected to bishops and other persons called ecclesiastical sitting in the Supreme Court of the nation. Okay, and Melville also showed the history of the gradual blending of ecclesiastical and civil jurisdiction under the papacy, by means of which the Roman pontiff became at last so formidable, armed himself with the two swords, trampled on princes and transferred crowns and kingdoms at his pleasure. Take heed, said he, addressing James, that you do not set up those who shall cast you or your successors down. Okay, so this doesn't completely answer all our questions, but we do see so the arguments for and against ministers being allowed to participate in Parliament. Second question, should the church's representatives in Parliament be appointed for life or on an annual basis? The king and his party wanted them appointed for life, and the better able to seduce them and work them into their mold. And the king's party, or the church, was only willing for the appointments to be on an annual term. Finally, what should the representatives be called? All right. The king's party said, insisted that he should have the name of bishop. If they agreed in the substance, they said the name was of little consequence. And as the Parliament had restored the title of bishop and might refuse to admit the representative of the church under any other designation, it would be a pity to lose a privilege which His Majesty had procured with such great pains and difficulty, though scrupulosity about a name which, after all, or through scrupulosity about a name which, after all, was scriptural. Okay. To this, Melville replied ironically, "No doubt the name episcopos or bishop is scriptural, and why should it not be given? But as something additional to the office of the Scripture bishop is to be allotted to our new Parliament men, I would propose to eke a little to the name, and this shall be scriptural also. Let us baptize them by the name which the Apostle Peter gives to such officers, and calls them elotrio episcopi, busy bishops, who meddle with matters foreign to their calling." So he continued to point out that that the term was actually used in the Scriptures to apply to all ministers of the gospel, but now it was understood in Scotland to be this higher office that which had a superiority of office and power. And anyways, the title was calculated to feed their vanity and lust of power. So, Mike.
Melville at this time, as I understood you saying, he was not for the ministers being in Parliament.
Right.
Okay. Was he thinking that keeping the ministers out of Parliament would also keep Parliament out of the ministers? Is that the two sides of that coin, in the fact that Parliament cannot rule on things of the church?
Yeah, I think that'd probably be one way of looking at it. He was primarily opposed because this was all coming lockstep, was that then these bishops would then rule over the church. So in fact, they would only be accountable to the king. So maybe it wasn't so much what the Parliament would do to the church, but rather what the king would do to the church through these men.
But was he then against the idea of having ministers in the Parliament?
Well, that was what they were arguing against. I don't know. I'm not really sure. I
think he was, right? By his bishop argument. He said, God called bishops to do certain things.
Yeah.
Make laws is not one of them.
Yeah, no, I guess that's true. I would say in general that they would be opposed to bishops being, or ministers being in the Parliament. I thought about this a little bit. I'm not sure, to what level you could continue the argument. Could you continue it down to a town council that meant one evening every 3 months or something? Maybe not. But presuming that Parliament was you have to remember at these times Parliament, it wasn't like they were nowhere near as tyrannical as our government, and they didn't meet all the time. So.
But his argument was, I think,
yeah.
that you couldn't execute or fulfill the calling that God had placed on you. Even today, if you're off in Washington all the time, how are you going to shepherd the flock?
Right.
You can't.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization of it. I don't know that it was absolute under every circumstance, but I think generally, yes.
But then what you're essentially going then, you're going to this idea of church and state, the separation between church and state. It's going to lead to that. And I thought that's what the Reformers wanted to get that separation down. The church would actually be on par with the state.
Well, the church is on par with the state in the sense that they're both separate dominions under God's authority, separate spheres of sovereignty. I don't know that the ideas are all completely worked out right in this argument, but I would. In general, they would have favored a separation from the standpoint that they didn't want. Generally, they didn't want the church to have an official voting voice, but rather they wanted the church to be able to be free to preach to the king and to the Parliament. In that sense, they would it's not this total separation of church and state that our government says, oh, you've preached on the election and we're going to take away your tax exemption.
But it appears to me that we're going through a facade right now on the fact that King James is doing executive orders left and right against the church.
Right.
Okay. Then he's going to Parliament and saying, hey, let's get Parliament in line also. I mean, the executive orders for him to have some on the church had already taken place.
Well, not completely. He's still working that out, right? So, I mean, when we started at the start of today's lesson, they only agreed to let him set the location of time and meeting place of the General Assembly. And beyond that, he didn't have a whole lot of other powers. But through what he's been doing in today's lesson is he's slowly putting everything under his thumb. So.
Didn't he also frankly he was going to throw these ministers, and didn't he already say that they could only say certain things in their
Yeah, okay, he's been working at that too.
That's executive order.
Yeah, no, I'm not questioning that. He's just in the process of as much as he can putting everything under his thumb. So.
And the church, I mean, I think it's amazing to me that the church has failed to issue its ultimate executive order and excommunicate the guy.
Yeah.
They should have kicked him out.
Yep.
And then gone on without him as best they could.
But he's got the guns, and the suburban. I mean, the guns.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting point. I haven't seen much discussion of it in the literature, as it were. One reason I think you're going to see this later is that they still had this very high view of the king, that even though they didn't like what he was doing and so on, they still, I guess, they were still men of their day, as we're men of our day, and
did they say character doesn't count?
Not yet.
The other thing that struck me is that these benefices have come back to get him again. I mean, because presumably these northern pastors lived in poverty because they had no rental property.
Right.
And so the king the king saw this chink in the armor of the church and just drove a wedge into it.
Right. So he could dole out small favors, and they seemed great,
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he did. That's what he was a master. He was very good at politics, and he knew where to exploit, which part of the church and exploit. There were some ministers in the church who clearly liked the idea of being bishops, and other ones that just he could kind of work this in so they'd be against the men from the south. Okay, well, when this conference quit going the way he wanted it, he ended it. He threatened to sink the ministers deeper into poverty, and to put into the vacant bishoprics people that he would choose, and who would do their duty to him and to the kingdom. So that was his sort of closing tantrum. So the next meeting was held then of the General Assembly was held on the 28th of March, 1600. When the day came, Melville went and sat down in the assembly, but the king kicked him out. There's this discussion between him and the king where he finally puts his hands around his neck and says, "If this is what you want, you can have it. You can have my head, but I'm not going to remit my responsibilities." So. Okay, there was probably at that meeting actually a consensus to retract this action of the last assembly. In other words, to retract this action that would allow ministers to vote in Parliament. But the king wouldn't allow him to go back to that. He said, no, that's a settled issue. You have to just discuss the details. Okay, so this issue of annual elections versus lifetime appointments came up. The king, with all of his kingcraft and politicking, still lost by a 3-vote margin. And they held out for annual elections. But the king, being clever, had the clerk of the assembly come to his palace to help write the minutes up. And he actually reworded the action so it came out the other way. So the assembly then produced a long list of qualifications, caveats intended to protect the church. And I probably don't have time to go through them all, but I think the point is if you saw all these limitations they were going to put on the office then you say, well, okay, it wouldn't be so bad. Let's see, just to give you a few of them. That the representative, first of all, they wouldn't be called bishops, they would be called commissioners. That the General Assembly would nominate 6 individuals in each province, and the king would choose one. This representative shouldn't presume to propose anything to Parliament, Council, or Convention in the name of the Church without her express warrant and direction, nor consent to the passing of any act prejudicial to the Church under the pain of deposition from his office. That each General Assembly should give an account of the manner in which he has discharged his commission and submit without appeal to the censure of the Assembly under the pain of infamy and excommunication. That he should rest satisfied with the part of the benefice allotted to him without encroaching upon what was assigned to the other ministers within his province. That he should perform all the duties of the pastoral office within his own particular congregation. That in the exercise of discipline, collation of benefices, and visitation of churches, and all other parts of ecclesiastical government, that the representative should claim no more power or jurisdiction than other ministers. And there's actually a number of other things in there, so that you could say, well, if all those were maintained, then it wouldn't be so bad. It really would meet a lot of their concerns. What you have to understand is that the king lied when he thought what was convenient. So if he could get them to agree with all these caveats, then he discarded the caveats later on. Okay? And so, in fact, in just October of the same year, 1600, he had his meeting of his council. James Melville was one of the counselors. He sent him on an errand. He and the other men that were likely to object. While they were gone, he appointed 3 men to vacant bishoprics, and at the next Parliament they voted in the Parliament without any commission from the Church at all, without any directions from the Church as to what to do, etc. So I mean, just literally lied until dissembled, and then 8 months later, nobody noticed, or they noticed, but he had his way. So. Okay, well, we better cease our official meeting. So, let's see. Mike, would you close us in prayer?